Way Media.
Welcome to episode 109 of the Filmumentaries podcast. This is Jamie Benning, speaking to you as usual from my house here in southeast London. Welcome to any new listeners. If this is your first episode, you have another 108 episodes to listen to. The podcast generally takes the form of an interview between me and one or sometimes a few other guests. Those guests are behind the scenes artists, including editors, VFX artists, directors, sound designers, and many more. Thanks to those of you that are returning to the podcast, and a special thank you to all of you who support the podcast. In fact, in the last 2 weeks, I've gotten another 4 new patrons via patreon.com/Jamie Benning. So that means there's now 119 of you helping to support the podcast. I want to get that number to 250 by this time next year. I mean, I said that last year, but yeah, thank you for your help. If you'd like to support the podcast, for just $12, that will pay for an entire year and at least 24 episodes. And you can do that at the address I said, patreon.com/Jamie Benning. For those of you that listened to my last episode, I hope you enjoyed it. My chat with Jet Green, Matt Painter, ex-ILM and DreamWorks. I did get some very nice feedback from a bunch of you on that one, so thank you for that. I always appreciate the feedback, good or bad. Otherwise, it's just me putting this stuff out with no idea on how it's going down. So yeah, keep that feedback coming. And in fact, talking of matte painting, I'm hoping to get in touch with another matte painter, Chris Evans, who worked on some amazing movies that we all grew up watching. Hopefully that will be in the coming weeks. As you know, I occasionally go off-piste with this podcast, and this is one of those episodes. I ended up going to the British Film Institute, the BFI, on the Southbank here in London, to catch up with friend and friend of the podcast, former guest, a couple of times in fact, Doug Weir. He invited me down there to talk about a new 35mm print of the 1933 classic King Kong and a screening of that very movie as well. And rather than going into the specifics about how that came about here in the intro, I'll just let you hear that in the conversation coming up. But just to say, Doug is the content remastering lead at BFI, and this time we were joined by his colleague, Kieron Webb. He's head of conservation at the BFI. So first of all, you'll hear Doug. He's got the Scottish accent. And then a little bit later in the conversation, you'll hear Kieron talking about the specifics about how the project came about. Again, we mentioned in the conversation, but it's worth saying here that if you do want to go and see this new print of the 1933 classic King Kong in 35mm with Doug Weir's intro beforehand on the 8th of September. So you haven't got much time, so book your tickets now. You can find those at the BFI website. And then there is a secondary screening without Doug's intro on the 16th of September. So that's at the BFI Southbank in London. I know there are a few of you listeners that live in London or can get to London. But if you don't, this is an interesting conversation anyway about film restoration and conservation and the projects that they do behind the scenes there at the BFI. So here's my conversation with the BFI's Doug Weir and Kieron Webb, and I'll be back at the end for a bit more jabbering on. So we're here to talk about this season of stop motion in which many films are playing, but also we're here to talk about King Kong in particular. Doug, can you give us some context of the film, of its sort of place in history? And then we'll talk to Kieron here about the print itself.
Wow, you just asked me to give context to King. Can you just tell us about King Kong?
It's a big question.
I mean, King Kong's, just to be clear to people who are listening, it's the one from 1933. Yeah. I hope that's what you're asking about.
Yeah. Well, no, all my research is on the 70s one, sorry.
No, I mean, that's such a huge question, and to to put the 1933, the original King Kong's place into the history of cinema, I mean, it is monumental. It's almost hard to even, for me anyway, because it's my favourite film, for so many reasons. There's so many levels of why it's a great film. It's very hard to encapsulate.
Yeah.
I mean, it's easier to sort of break it apart and say, you know, it's the visual effects. Obviously, that's probably the key bit. But it's also the storytelling. It's the way it's been directed. It's the music. It's the editing. Everything about that film, almost everything, was pioneering. I think the only thing that wasn't pioneering was probably the film stock, because it was just, you know, probably Kodak film stock that was being used and all. But everything else was almost brand new to cinema. What they were doing was so far ahead of its time, probably in my opinion, so far ahead of its time that cinema didn't catch up, you know, for maybe 20, 30 years until, you know, other people came along and started being influenced by it. Even the films that followed it were never quite as pioneering.
Some of those techniques used, like matte painting, is older than that movie, obviously, and some of the things, you know, like giant robotic puppets and things. But this film managed to sort of perfect those techniques, and also the combination of those different techniques in a single shot is kind of what's mind-blowing. Even looking back now, and this is like 1931, 32, released in 33, it's kind of baffling that they were able to come up with these ideas and then combine them in a single shot.
Yeah, you talk about matte paintings, but it's, as you say, the combination of those techniques, they were just throwing everything at the wall. They had people on conveyor belts running in front of rear projection, but then you had rear projection within matte painting composited with real water. I mean, there's shots in there where there's almost everything that they could achieve at that time in one shot. And you've got Kong, you've got other creatures, you've got live action in one little corner. And as I said, you've got real water, you've got real, you know, trees, and then you've got matte paintings, and then you've got glass layers, and then you've got, like, you know, focus depth of the camera focusing in different layers and pulling out. It's almost inconceivable for that era, for something to be that perfect, but it is. And I think we were chatting beforehand, and like I was saying beforehand, it's almost like how I'd love to be in the meeting where they're going, I've got this idea, and they go, well, we've done matte shots with you know, Fay Ray can just stand in front of a rear projection. It's like, yeah, but what if we did this and that and then did this? And they obviously just absolutely went for it. I mean, one of the reasons that they did really go huge on King Kong is because if you look at RKO at the time, RKO was my favourite Hollywood studio from that era. They were in a bit of a slump, and it was kind of like, you know, we've got to hit big. So they obviously sat around the table and just said, look, whatever you've got, let's just do it, let's go for it. And Marion C. Cooper, who was big on his adventure films, just went for it, you know, his idea about Kong.
It is crazy that, you know, I read this morning actually that it went over budget considerably, and I think it went over time a bit, but it has become culturally so important. I mean, even my kids who have never been anywhere near the movie know what it is. They understand. As soon as you see that image of him at the top of the Empire State Building,
spoilers,
which is only part of the movie, it's only a very small part really, because there's so many sequences in that film.
It's got that Chaplin, I call it the sort of Chaplin effect, where you can show a little kid a picture of Charlie Chaplin and they just know. Yeah. You know, and the King Kong and the Empire State Building, I think it's because it's become such an iconic, as you say, image, and it does appear in so many different mediums, and it's referenced so much that even if people don't link it with King Kong, they recognise it because it might be on the side of a cup. Yeah. You know, in a takeaway place, or I've seen it on the side of a plastic cup in like a burger joint, and you're like, it doesn't. And it was in New York. Obviously, that's the connection. But the New York uses it. Yeah. If you go to the Empire State Building today, there's a King Kong like there in the foyer.
Well, I think when Fay Ray died, I think they dimmed the lights on the Empire State Building for a day, and I mean, it just goes to show what an impact it had. I was thinking as well this morning, when is the next time a visual effects character is so loved? And it's probably Gollum. Doug, tell us about your love for Lord of the Rings.
I've never seen them.
That was deliberate. Doug told me beforehand. We'd not seen it.
Yeah, sorry about that, everybody.
But I think that probably is. I can't think of another purely visual effects creature that is so loved and appreciated and seems to have a personality.
I would probably say, I don't know how big it was at the time, but Godzilla in the 50s. And then obviously RKO again was in a slump in the 50s and did that deal with Toho to do King Kong versus Godzilla.
Yeah.
So Kong was the guy they kept bringing out to revive the studio's expenses. But going back to how pioneering it was as well leaves an indelible mark on people's brains of how perfect a film it was. I think that for me is the thing that makes it timeless. Is it was never no other film like that. They perfected the animation techniques and everything, but the storytelling and the combination of those things never really struck it for they never really hit it again for a few decades. And even the music. I mean, a lot of people don't realize that the music in King Kong. It was the first time. Obviously, we had silent films, and a lot of silent films had people, improvising as they watched the film. But this was the first film to have a score composed and recorded specifically for what is going on screen. So everybody had their own theme tune, or their, whatever you call that, motif. And the music cuts to the action. There's moments in the film where the action takes a left turn or a right turn, and the music goes with it. And before you even see Kong himself, you hear him, his footsteps, but it's not his footsteps, it's the orchestra going hum, 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 hum. And that's the first time that music had been used almost in a sort of storytelling way to imply what was about to happen or to imply what's going on screen. And also, this is like 5 years after we were still getting silent films. That's the other thing that's amazing. It's like it's such a huge leap forward in that post-production technology world. In that 5 years before, we were still having people going in front of us. Well, I mean, it was better than that, but it was silent cinema. and as Kieron and I, in another discussion, can tell you how great silent films are as well. And silent films, there are silent films, from pre-Kong that were incredibly well edited and incredibly dramatic and fantastic. But Kong almost was too early for its own era, in that it came into the sound era and said, we can do all these things with sound. And we can do all this. But then after Kong, if you look at what was made, in the years following, it's just like they're back to the old, just having one jazz track in the background and people mixing cocktails, being witty to each other. It's like they never caught up with that again.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to appreciate what it must have been like going from silent movies and, as you say, with an organist playing along, and then coming to a film like this where you've got a full, score specifically made for it with sound effects and everything else.
And then the most amazing visual effects that had ever been created.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I was looking back at them again last night, and some of them, even though I saw a description side by side of how they achieved that shot, I was still going, what? How? How did you pull that off back then?
It's just the sheer imagination, and it's one or two. It's Willis O'Brien plus a few assistants and animators, but that's it. And the only other time I can think of, I mean, I'm no historian, but if you can think about people, you talk to people referencing that mind-blowing moment in the cinema, it's either after that, it's like a lot of people talk about Star Wars and go, oh my God, I've never seen anything like that, because they were inventing techniques, which you've documented, a lot in this podcast. But then after that, maybe Jurassic Park, where people go, I've never seen anything like this before. But like Jurassic Park, in fact, it's a really good example, is you watch Jurassic Park and you don't see the visual effects. You're just it's such a well-made film, and it's so well written and directed and edited, and the visual effects, there's actually not that much CGI in Jurassic Park. It's not as much as people think. I remember at the time it was like, they're all computer generated, but it turns out it's only a few sequences. But you're just so into it. It's so well combined. And Kong's like that. But even in King Kong, you look at Kong and you're like, that is fake. That is so, they can see that it's like sort of Wallace and Gromit. You see the fingerprints, you see his hair ruffling, and you can tell it's a 1.5 foot size armature, and it's been built, and it's not hugely realistic. But because it's so well animated and there's so much humanity put into that creature, that character, you're just totally in on it, and I cry every time.
There was one review at the time that said you even see the wind rushing through Kong's fur atop the Empire State Building, but of course it was Willis O'Brien's fingers going in there. And
that's a good way
that.
To sort of fudge.
I quite like that.
It's the wind. All right.
Yeah. There are multiple different versions of the film, in as much as the film was cut. Some sequences were cut here in the UK, some were cut in the US. They were different scenes, from what I understand.
I mean, my main function here at the BFI is preparing films for distribution and on the different platforms, on cinema and video, Blu-ray, DVD, and streaming. And So I've been doing that for about 15 years. And even in the 15 years that I've been doing that, you notice the different ways that the BBFC here in the UK changes. You know, we're re-releasing Watership Down, plug. We're releasing Watership Down in cinemas and on UHD and Blu-ray later in the year. And famously, I submitted that to the BBFC last year, and famously it got an upgrade from U to PG because they were viewing it in a different light. And very recently it was in the press that Nightmare on Elm Street got downgraded from 18 to 15. So I think the censorship, even going back then, it's just about who's watching it, what the legislation or the rules are, and those change all the time. You know, going right through to like the video nasties, and then all that stuff you can watch for free on Amazon now. But when I was younger, it's like I had to get pirate videos of some stuff that you can just watch for free. Like you know, a kid could just switch on TV on Amazon and there it is. Whereas I had to go to video shops and get dodgy backroom VHS.
I went just down the road here to Westminster Central Halls for the film shows and things, and you get a little undercounter copy of
Kong,
whatever. Yeah,
I didn't know this about Kong until literally yesterday when I was looking, and I've got the Making of King Kong book and a few other things because I'm a massive film nerd. But there was another so they censored Kong, and there were different censors cuts, as you say, in America, in the US. The famous one that everyone always talks about is when he smells his fingers and he peel back their clothes.
Yes,
but there's also other little bits where it's just like shocking, violence. It's a very violent film. But they also made a print in the 60s, I think it was, that was darkened. So they darkened the print to sort of make it, because they thought by darkening it would cover up a lot of the threat, as the censors would like to call it, and make it easier to watch, or it'd make it less frightening. So there were darkened prints out there. And it wasn't until the late 60s that the film was put back together again, and new prints were made, and it had a rerun, and then a whole new generation of people who you've interviewed were. I think actually I read the other day that there was a famous TV screening in the 60s where they showed it several times over one weekend, and there's a whole generation of filmmakers and visual effects guys who saw that.
Right, interesting.
And that got their head going. But it was re-released after it was put back together again in the late 60s, and that's when it was. A lot of people think these films are Kieron and I, we work in remastering and restoring films now, and sometimes the work that we do is the first time a film's been put back together since, the 1920s or 30s. But with Kong, actually, it wasn't that long after. It was only, 30 years. You've got to remember it's 1933. So, but it was the 60s. It was the late 60s. And then ever since then, it's been complete.
And there was that original copy discovered in the UK sometime. I think I read it was in the early 70s. Which had some of those deleted scenes in it, and it was in better condition than other prints that were around.
Well, there was also a copy discovered 20 years ago behind a brick wall in Glasgow in my old local cinema.
No way.
They were converting it and demolishing it, and there was this King Kong film print.
I wonder how that happens.
Well, you'd be surprised. Honestly, you find film prints and all, but bricking a film print up is one thing, and King Kong.
Yeah.
I don't know anything.
Thank you to that person.
I don't know what happened to that print. All I remember is that being in the news. Was it an original print or anything? I don't know what happened. Yeah, it's gone now. I don't know where it is, that print, but it was found in Glasgow behind a brick wall about 25 years ago.
Yeah.
It's probably in someone's house.
There was a colourised print
I hope it's not nitrate.
There was a colourised print in the 80s as well. There was that horrible fashion there for a while to sort of try and get younger audiences back in, that. But we can gloss over that one.
Well, I saw that, and Kong had a sort of purple tinge to him. I remember that. Yeah, for years I thought It's a Wonderful Life was colour because my granddad had the colourised VHS.
Yeah,
and then I saw it in black and white, and I thought, what's going on here? But there was. I mean, Kieron can probably talk about this more than me, but there was the best copies of the film when it came to putting it back together and restoring it were in the UK.
So, Kieron, can you talk about this latest print then and kind of the origins of it?
Yeah. It just have to sort of widen out a little bit because this is part of a program that ran for 5 years, but with a COVID interruption. So we started in 2017 with National Lottery funding,
right?
And it was really a strategy to create 100. That's a suspiciously round number, isn't it? But it was based actually on what we thought the money that we could bid for and received. How many prints could we get? And we knew they would be feature length. Features vary naturally, but Kong is a trim 100 minutes or so.
104.
104.
I think.
The last print we achieved, poetically enough, was Jeanne Dielman, which is worth quite a few Kongs in terms of length. So
that's that 3.5 hours.
About 3.5.
Yeah, right.
Have I got time to just describe a bit of prehistory on this print program? So I brought along one of my treasures, which is a Sight and Sound supplement from the late 90s, 98. And
very nice.
At that time, so you and people listening might be familiar with the books, the BFI Film Classics series. They're those paperback, I don't know what size it is technically, but they actually would fit in your pocket, in
they're
your back
great.
pocket.
They're little guides, aren't they? It's like intros to
Exactly.
sort of film scholars type stuff.
Exactly that monograph. Yeah, and the range of writers chosen to discuss a film is not all usual suspects and so on. So that came from one of our great keepers of fiction film. That was his title, David Meeker, and he worked at BFI for about 40 years.
Right.
He interviewed me for a job in late 2000, just before he retired. So the fact he gave it to me is either his last gift to the BFI or his parting shot. I don't know which, but David was asked, he explains in that supplement, at the time the draftsman's contract was bringing in money. It was actually a BFI produced film that was commercially successful, and this was not the point of them always, but unheard of in any case. And the then director of the BFI asked him what would he do with that money, and it's very interesting. This is early 80s then, and David said, I'd like to build a library of show prints. So even in absolutely pre-digital to all the way that we would think of it, pre-digital era, he wanted really nice show prints of let's use the word important titles. He goes into a bit more detail about the list. And he came up with a list of 100. It grew to 360, and there was this idea that if we achieved all of those prints, you could watch every day of the year, because the NFT, as it was then, BFI Southbank now, wasn't open 365 days a year, but 360. So every year, once, you could see Kane, you could see Kong, you could see Vertigo, you could see Seven Samurai, you could see Throne of Blood. And about half that number of prints were achieved. I used to come and watch them here before I joined the BFI, late 90s, I suppose. You'd see them only in NFT3, the museum cinema. And if they were non-English language, they decided not to subtitle the prints in order to keep them kind of pristine in that way. And you would put headphones on and someone would be delivering the dialogue to you that way, right?
Those booths, those commentary booths, are still in the building. Yeah,
Is that right?
They're full of boxes. Yeah,
yeah. And I heard a colleague of mine does remember that. I'm sorry, I don't remember the person's name, but the guy who did Throne of Blood when I saw it there was great. I mean, he just slightly put on the witches kind of, tenor,
Dramatised.
but not camp. It
nice.
was great. And then another time, Rocco and his brothers, I saw that way. So, okay, so that was David Meeker's list. It's quite a personal list, like he said it should be. You can't program by committee, he said, but it does include for 360 titles. It's got about 13, 14 John Fords on there. Now, I love Ford, but that's quite a high.
Yeah.
That's quite a high proportion.
Yeah.
And Jean-Pierre Melville, David was a big fan. So more recently, cutting to 15, 16, as we put in this application to National Lottery. Even then, it felt like quite a brave thing to do for our then creative director, Heather Stewart. Very keen to support film as a medium, to recognise it as a medium. And but the idea of someone funding the creation of 100 new prints felt, it would be a fantastic thing to do, very, very valuable. But luckily, National Lottery understood. And so we began work to look at David's 360 list, a committee of... just remembered that David said shouldn't program by committee, but a group of BFI colleagues, not me, looked at the list, and we wanted to bring it a bit more up to date as well, because the last film on his list is Mad Max 2.
Okay.
And he felt, you should have that gap in a way. So he was late 90s, he was doing that work. There's that gap. Similarly, on our list, there is a gap too, although it's not quite as big a gap. I'm just going to double check what that most recent title is on our list. Early 2000. Okay, so Hunger, Steve McQueen's Hunger, and The Headless Woman. They're the two most recent titles on the list. Of our 100, so we looked at David's 360 list. We've updated that, but we knew we couldn't achieve 360 prints. Would love to. We'll carry on best we can, but we had a lottery funding to achieve 100, and we did. In fact, we made 105. So that's and some of them, in some cases, we could afford to get 2 prints, but that was unusual, pretty highly. I think 2 or 3 titles actually we could get 2 prints. Right. So these are show prints. They're some of them are absolutely exceptional quality. I mean, the
original neg.
Some
really?
From original negative, including Persona and Daisies. So that's that's
very
really
cool.
something.
Yeah.
But we should recall, and I think getting back to Kong, film is about duplication, and when these films were made, that is how it had to happen. And Kong contains, he contains multitudes. Kong, right? He's got the match shot, so there's already duplication going on
within the frame.
Within the frame, you'll have. In one frame, you could have maybe 8, 9, 10 duplications in Kong. So as you're saying, already at that point, it's gone through that many dupes before it even gets made into a dupe neg or a fine grain or a print.
Which, of course, is why later they went for VistaVision, a larger format, so that when you went down a generation, you didn't lose the detail. Too much of an extent.
What's been great. This sounds a bit selfish, really, but I guess I feel very fortunate that one thing, when I was studying film, in what turns out to be 30 years ago, I was at a college where they ran print 35mm if they could get hold of it, or if that was the right format. I think we saw 2 video, and it would have been tape in those days, 2 video projections, but otherwise it was print. And then similarly, checking these prints, I couldn't stay for all 100. Unfortunately, colleagues of mine covered a lot of that work. But it did remind me, when it came to optical effects, how far ahead the American industry was with the development of those optical printers. The first title I really noticed it on. So when you're watching French or British or German productions, Italians of the time, even well into the 30s, it looks like they're actually almost bypacking the film rather than, in other words, the scene that's going to fade out and the scene that's going to fade in are in the printer together, sandwiched together to create the effect. Whereas one of the first films we made a new one of these prints for was I Walked with a Zombie. I mean, fantastic title, and fine grain made from original negative at the Library of Congress, then a new dupe neg that we had made, and a new soundtrack negative. And so that those optical effects, those dissolves, you're seeing them produced through photographically, really. And they're so smooth. I mean, if you did a remastering, people would almost be suspicious you'd remade them or tidied them up. But the truth is, it's a great reference, a film like that. And Kong, similarly, I mean, that's probably a decade earlier than the I Walked with a Zombie. But still, the techniques and the photographic techniques to get that result, when you think about how many layers are in it, is incredibly impressive.
Mind-boggling, really.
currently now, going to Kong is you were talking about I Walk with the Zombies. What was it? The print
RKO as well, of course.
It was RKO. Yeah, well, it was RKO as well. But you were working. I mean, that print looked. I mean, that's one of the prints I saw as well. I Walk with the Zombie. It looks really beautiful. But it was made from. What was the element it was made from? You just said.
So it was in the case of that one, its original negative is at Library of Congress archive. They printed a fine grain positive,
and then there was a
new dupe neg was made,
and then the print was made from that. Whereas Kong doesn't have an original neg, let alone barely anything else. They've got. I think the closest they've got is a 4th generation away from it, but it still looks fantastic. It still looks really, really great. But there's lots of, as Kieron will probably be able to tell better than myself, there's lots of different ways of printing and lab techniques to really bring out the quality and detail of something that is quite a few generations away from the original neg to try and make it look as great as possible. And that's part of the restoration techniques.
So what are some of those techniques you've used then to get the print up to the standard that it is now?
Well, one of the best. I'm laughing because one of the best techniques you can use is choose the right lab to work with. Right?
Yeah.
That's one of the best things you can do from an archival perspective.
I mean, there are prints that you can watch, and I'm not one of these people. Maybe in a small instance, but there are people that are colleagues who will watch a print and they can tell you straight away that was made there.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, because just the way it looks.
Really?
Yeah.
So again, just a bit widely on this latest sort of printmaking initiative, the 100 prints funded by National Lottery, we intended always to work locally. So in other words, where there was the materials, let's work with a lab nearby to help, not unnecessarily put elements at risk of travelling. In some cases, they do have to travel. So, for example, for the Australian, New Zealand titles in the list, they went to the west coast of the States because that's that's as close as more or less as there'll be labs to work with. We worked a lot with 2 labs in LA that will probably be familiar names. So one is Photochem, who, of course, Christopher Nolan, Emma Thomas work with in terms of post-production on their films. And we worked with them a lot. The other is a more boutique lab, but very long-standing in Burbank, is YCM Labs. And they carried out in probably mid-late 80s, they carried out preservation, restoration work on King Kong. They brought together a lot of materials, including, as we said, nitrate dupes held here at the BFI. And so this is, in the end, they produced a negative that was held by Warner Brothers. And a soundtrack. It's important. You'd be surprised how many times we went after titles. And to digress a little bit, if you ask me why this 100 or 105 titles, there's also a kind of the other side of the coin is titles that we wanted to do, but there just aren't printing elements available. So the titles are preserved. It's not a question that they're unpreserved somehow, unprotected. But in order to have a negative that's ready to go for printing, along with a soundtrack negative that syncs, is a different matter. Yeah. So there's this kind of, I don't know what to call it, not a shadow list, but the kind of interlocking list. And there was a moment where we weren't sure that there was a sound negative ready to go with King Kong, and our budget didn't really stretch to producing new film elements, but fortunately they had in the library, so we wanted to work with YCM again. We noticed, Doug and I checked a earlier print of Kong that we had, came from the same dupe negative, we would call it duplicate negative of the full feature. And what we could see is that Eric, the grader at YCM, who's a terrific both colour and black and white grader, timer, as they refer to it in the States, he'd given... you know that he won't just print straight away again with the lights from last time. He's taken another look, and we could just see where he's balanced even more. So that's such a crucial process that at any moment, but with these historic titles and a negative that's probably nearly 40 years old then, this one from the 80s, he could just add those last improvements, touches.
Yeah.
So the print that's showing on the 8th of October?
8th of September.
September even?
So it's showing twice. If you can't make it on the 8th, I'll be introducing it on the 8th of September. It's a Sunday afternoon. It's off-peak travel, it's cheap, and it'll be showing again the next day. And it's actually, you can get a double ticket with the mighty Joe Young. So it's showing on the Sunday, the 8th, and Monday the 9th. And I can't tell you if it'll be showing again, because as we've just been talking about it extensively, it's a print that's been made to preserve. So this is a real one-off, or twice off. It's getting shown twice, but it's a real one-off opportunity to see something and it is a beautiful print. I mean, I've seen King Kong. It's my favourite film, so I've seen it in every medium. I even own a print on Super 8, and I've seen it and it looks incredible. I've got the Blu-ray. It looks great, but seeing something on the cinema screen. It's a film designed to be seen big, and it's a 35mm print, so it's not like watching a DCP. You were at Jaws, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like,
it's a whole different film.
The whole thing about Jaws was, my message was, all right, you think you've seen this, but trust me, afterwards you're going to be coming up to me and going, I thought I'd seen that before, but I hadn't. It's a whole different experience seeing a print projected, and this is again another, probably one of the main reasons for Kieron's project is to preserve that experience in cinema, to be able to, in years down the line, to say, we can see King Kong or any of these other titles as the way they were intended to be seen. Digital projection is an amazing thing to keep cinema alive, and it's a great way to preserve films as well. I call it preservation through distribution, because King Kong can be re-released across the UK at very little expense if it's distributed digitally, and it will look incredible. But you've got to preserve that original experience. It's like having the Mona Lisa, making the best print of the Mona Lisa ever and then sending it to all the different galleries. It's not the same as standing in front of the Mona Lisa.
I described it when we saw Jaws here, that it was like time travel for me. I genuinely felt like I was back in 75. I wasn't even born. I was born in 76, but it felt like time travel because it was there with the original colour timing. It was the original mono mix. It was with an audience, some of which had never seen the film, which was great.
My mum, we chatted about this in the other podcast, but the other great thing about Jaws, the print of Jaws, not to talk about Jaws too much, is it wasn't perfect. And I think, that, again, with King Kong, is people have got to remember that photochemical is not perfect. Digital is perfect. It's like digital visual effects. They're too perfect. It takes hundreds of people to micromanage pixels. And I know people that work in visual effects, they will have people micromanaging pixels on a visual effects shot, but it won't be as memorable as King Kong, just walking through the jungle. Because
scratching his ear, right?
Yeah, scratching his ear.
Is that quote, am I misremembering the quote about... was it Willis O'Brien? A great monster is one that you can imagine at repose or in repose. That's just beautiful, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's a shot in the film where they're in the foreground and it's in the background. There's the T-Rex and he just scratches his ear, and it's just beautiful. And I remember I studied animation, and I remembered, obviously even by the point where I was a teenager studying animation, I was already doing that because of King Kong and because of just being fascinated how does this work? How are these things put together? Which kind of led to working here because it got me interested in the photochemical side of things. But also, I remember doing these, you had to do these exercises, and there's no, you can do this at film school in the UK now, but this was like an entry-level college that was for boat building in Scotland. But they had this little art school in the basement where you could study practical animation. It's long gone. And it was, this is amazing. So I went there with no qualifications, but part of the exercises was doing different things. And I remember the shot in King Kong of the T-Rex just scratching its ear. So I always made sure that every time I did something, you say, do an exercise with a bird flying so you can do follow through motion and all that sort of stuff. I always made sure the bird did something else, like just sort of, like shook its leg or something, because that suddenly gave it that little bit of reality. I remember my mate still talks about it. He said, do you remember we did that exercise of characters just walking? It's really hard to get a character to walk. This is what is amazing about Kong, is it just to get a character to walk across the screen is really difficult. It takes a long time. Yeah. But I thought, hey, what if I got my character to walk from left to right? But as he's walking from left to right, he'll just sort of put his fingers through his plasticine hair and just sort of push his fringe back. And I did that, and everybody went, oh. And I was like, and then I went, that's the important bit. It's not the spaceship doing the most amazing thing. It's the guy in the cockpit picking his nose.
Yeah. I was saying this to Phil Tippett. I interviewed him for episode 100.
Oh, I mean, there's the master, right?
I said to him, he's a very humble guy and he doesn't take praise well.
No, I listened to that podcast.
I said to him, regardless of the quality of the film that his work is in, his work always stands out because it not stands out as in takes you out of the film, but it has personality to it.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, it's a total humanity, if you ask me. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, the character is just, he doesn't feel human, but it's a humanity, there's an empathy right there. And that's almost like distilling some kind of gold dust thing into a character. You can do your character walking left to right and putting his fingers through his hair, but if you feel really sad because he falls over, then that's it,
I also think what's really interesting when you rewatch or see King Kong that you might not remember is the opening sequences and that Depression era, that sort of hangover of Depression era economics. And I suppose Kong itself is coming just after the pre-code era in Hollywood, so that the code is beginning to get enforced and formalized a bit more, but that it's quite a long that's not a complaint, by the way, but it's just that setup of Fay Wray looking for work and
I can tell you
the motivation of that in terms of setting off with
it's about 45 minutes until Kong actually appears, so it's about half an hour until they get to the island. You can tell I've seen it, but I always thought that the opening of Kong and that amazing footage of New York, and the other thing is there's no music after the opening credits. There's no music until they get to the island. So that
which for Max Steiner is
incredible. Max Steiner, exactly. He's sitting there going,
someone sat on him.
It must not conduct
tied
music.
Up like Kong was.
It must not conduct. But there's no music, and I think it's all deliberate. And going back to that Depression era, it's got that idea that I'm going to give them a show they've never seen before. I'm going to pull them out of that slump. And again, that's like RKO at the time. It's like, we need a big hit, so we're just going to throw everything and the kitchen sink in here. And you see that in the film. It's like, America's in a depression, let's just give them the biggest film they've ever seen. And in the film, it's like, America's in its depression, let's just let's get a monster and give them something they've never seen before and make money.
It really relates, doesn't it, to the musicals of the time, and Fred and Ginger is to come afterwards, but still that sort of show business it just courses through it. It's more than that. It's showmanship, isn't it?
Fred and Ginger, it's either that year or a year or so later, I can't remember, but I mean those films are amazing, and I love the Fred and Ginger musicals like Top Hat but they were very typical. I mean, they were huge, but they were very typical of a type of filmmaking at the time, which was musicals and jazz music and upper classes in Manhattan, and as I said earlier, shaking cocktails and being really witty to each other. Kong was nothing like that.
Shaking men off a tree trunk.
Yeah, they were shaking
cocktails.
Kong was shaking.
That sequence, actually, I watched it about 3 times last night because it is very complex, that scene. I mean, I'm sure VFX experts still look at that today and go, how the heck did they pull that off? It's
those amazing little touches. It's like I was saying, the finger through the hairs thing and the T-Rex scratches his ear. I watched a tiny clip last night just to sort of refresh my brain, and it was, the bit where he goes, all hell breaks loose, spoilers, towards the end, and he's going through. I mean, my favourite bit is the train, and the music again takes a total. It's like a change of gear in the music and in the film. You suddenly got it's the sound of the tracks, and you've got there's actors in the train. The train's made of it's 2 parts. There's the model part, then there's the live action part in the foreground, and then there's a bit where Kong just picks up a car or something, he just throws it, but then it comes back into the foreground as a practical effect. To think these processes through as a 1 or 2 guys and to achieve them is really, really difficult. Nowadays, you could do that in your bedroom on your laptop, and there you go, it's too easy. Whereas back then, to orchestrate that, I mean, it's a huge process, but also the little detail of something going from being, a model car with Kong just chucking it over his shoulder while he's climbing a building to suddenly coming back just briefly in the foreground as a practical effect, so that the actors in the foreground who are, acting in front of what would have probably been a black screen, can react to it and be physical with it. The physics of it is incredible.
Yeah.
When he goes up the building and he's, one of my other favourite bits is when there's the couple and he's looking for...
I was just going to say the same thing, yeah.
He's looking for Fay Ray and he's looking through the window, and then this big hand comes in.
And there's already a rear projection in the window, and the hand comes in the other window.
Yeah, and then he's like, that's not her, so he just throws her away.
There is something about the combination of all these things we talked about, like the character in Kong and within the animation, the complexity of the effects, and the combination of those effects, yet you still buy it all. It's something to do with all of those. It's like the perfect storm somehow.
It's the sort of Jurassic Park is a good sort of modern, well, I say modern, that's a long time ago, but a modernish example of that.
Years already.
In that you've got the T-Rex, and most of that sequence is a practical effect. But then there's like one or two shots where she walks across the screen and it's CGI.
Yeah.
But because it's so beautifully, put together,
all
the colour and all the as grading, or as Kieron says, timing in the States, all of it matches. All the eye lines match. Those are the really important, actual physical things. Because that all works, and in King Kong, because it all works, you believe it.
Yeah.
But if you're a not very good director,
yeah, absolutely,
and you've got all the tools, if none of these little things match or meet, it just falls apart because your brain just goes, nah. Yeah. And in going back to the Jaws example, the shark never worked. So they're just like that. We'll just don't show it because people won't believe it.
Joe Alves tells me otherwise.
Oh, sorry.
But that's something for my doco when I finally finish it. I was going to say as well, directly to the people listening, yes, you've ditched Netflix and Amazon, and you've got your curated Blu-ray collections, and you've got King Kong on VHS and DVD and Blu-ray, but come down here, come outside, come to see the film in a theatre with a group of people. Unfortunately, I'm working. I'm going to miss it.
September the 8th. Come to the BFI Southbank. It's one of the few cinemas that can project nitrate and all sorts of film formats.
Yeah.
And you'll be seeing it on the main screen as well.
Yeah. You think you know it, but you don't until you see it on the big screen. I've never seen it on the big screen.
And with a crowd.
Yeah,
I was going to say, it's a big crowd already. It's selling fast.
Great.
And Doug's intro is worth,
I
would say, the price of a ticket.
Definitely.
Alone. But it's true for films that you know off by heart. But when you see them with an audience, that's when you really know. I remember, it doesn't matter in a way, I can't remember exactly which film it is, but one of Fritz Lang's American, Hollywood titles, like Secret Beyond the Door, something like that, that kind of era. But it wasn't until I saw it here with an audience that I could really appreciate from their reactions, how daring they're being a filmmaker, because all right, it's a different era and so on, but still
something about the communal experience where you bounce off each other.
Those sudden turns, and I think Kong is full of that stuff because he is such a great character, Kong, and we've got sympathies, fear, just mix and change over the course of the movie. For him, of him.
I defy you not to cry at the end. I always cry at the end of King Kong.
I cry after your introduction stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to say, you were there at Jaws, which is a great example of. I mean, there was a guy at Jaws dressed in Jaws clothes, you know, and the audience was so into that. That's one of the very few screenings I've been at where it's just electric. Yeah. And everyone's cheering and shouting and jumping out of their seats. Yeah. And that's a film everybody knows. Yeah. Off by heart. Yeah. Backwards. Yeah. And I mean, to have an experience like that, I mean, Kieron's totally right. Seeing a film in the cinema that you've seen many, many times is a different experience. This is embarrassing, but I'm going to come out public about it. I went to see Star Trek 3: The Search for Spock in the IMAX. I took my partner to see it. She'd never seen it on a Saturday morning, and I cried. I've seen that film so many times, and now I think this is actually one of the best ones, and that's not a very popular opinion, but it was just so beautiful.
You're in a safe space here.
I'm in a safe space with a public podcast, but the just so many hundreds of listeners. But the visual effects, because the film had been remastered in 4K properly and faithfully and sympathetically to those 1983, 84 effects, they looked incredible, and you were just in it. And it's a very well made film. Whereas it was always held as one of the lesser ones. Whereas and that's also a testament to films being remastered and restored and being presented correctly, which is very important.
Yeah.
If there's a moment just to add on in terms of the 100 prints that we've created, or just over, as I mentioned, 105, 106, something like that. It's titles and number of prints, but this is very active, working out how to show and lend prints. So I'm conscious. I mean, I'm from Cornwall, right? And when I was growing up, movie drone was the way I could watch stuff. I saw Ran in a VHS, which had been letterboxed. So, how many lines of resolution was that?
Yeah.
I saw Playtime in a similar kind of way, but still grabbed somehow.
Yeah.
So we are conscious. The thing is, with archival prints, you don't want to cut them in any way, the leaders and so on. So you need a cinema theatre that can show with changeover. So two projectors, reel one, reel two, alternating. In the UK, this is a few dozen theatres. So we're working actively with that UK network, I suppose, to help get these prints seen. So far, I think about 9 of them showed at Film on Film Festival. One of those was Mildred Pierce, also made at YCM Labs, thanks to Academy Film Archive and Criterion, actually, for the soundtrack, and a lot of work by ourselves, Fiona Maxwell, who was head of our kind of relationships with rights holders and so on during this programme, incredibly important. And that showed because there was an issue with one of the projectors on that opening night, and we couldn't show the nitrate print of Mildred Pierce then. Yeah. So we had this brand new safety print to go ahead. Beautiful print. Watershed in Bristol has shown over a couple of years more titles, and in October 2 of these prints, Vertigo and The Apartment, are going to show at the widescreen weekend in Bradford at the National Media Museum Picture House there. So that will be public premieres for those 2 prints. So we're working to with others to get them, but also remember, I've described them to some of my colleagues actually as they're a constellation, these 100 prints in the sort of galaxy of fantastic prints that we care for at the archive, and part of caring for them is making sure that they go out to the right place and come back.
Yeah.
And it's not unknown for things to go missing in shipping. This idea that prints can be remade, which is, as I joined the archive, okay, you make another one. Well, that's not impossible now, obviously, and we're rejuvenating our black and white processing lab at the archive with contact and optical printers and process control and so on. It's quite a thing to do these days, but it's certainly nowhere near as cheap as it once was, relatively. So there's all that to take into account, but of course you don't make prints without wanting people to see them.
No.
But there's prints and prints and prints, and it's that's what needs the really careful management to understand actually what is the history of this print you've got in your hand. What makes that Jaws print very special is not the same as what makes this print of Kong that we're going to run very special. Even though they both are, it's not the same reason behind it. So that's really. But I'm very glad. It's a nice problem to have, because almost ever since I joined the archive, so getting on for 25 years next year, I've been hearing about the death of film, and yet here we were during this 5-year programme with hundreds of cans turning up, and it was like the old days in a way, not just hard drives and Peli cases and things. It was, so it's something that I hadn't predicted, actually. That I could imagine that we would be using film in the background, if you like, making preservation copies and that kind of thing. Preserving a silent film to a lovely new modern duplicate negative. But the idea that pretty actively making and lending prints beyond just other organisations like ourselves around the world was not something we necessarily anticipated. So we're not That's very active thinking going on there, but it's a lot to care for these prints and make sure that they are there to be seen.
There's definitely a massive interest for people viewing film on film, if you pardon the pun. I think analog and digital, we've sort of reached a space where they coexist very happily. I remember 10 or so years ago, all the film labs were being ripped out, and that's it. It's over, and it's all going to be digital. That's not the case. Film labs are reopening, smaller film labs, albeit they're not huge labs like they were. The deluxe labs are long gone, but and people are shooting on film. You can shoot film, your feature on film or your short film on film now, and it costs just as much, maybe cheaper than shooting on digital, because the expense with digital is the data management. And also, at the end of the day, having a film print or a film negative is actually a lot more and future-proof than having a hard drive still. I know of some people who are doing film outs from digital to preserve on film, because it's a lot more secure and easier to look after, quite frankly, than digital. And in 20, 30, 40 years, USB 2 won't be able to be plugged in, but you'll still be able to hold a film print up and look at it through a light bulb,
Yeah.
And it'll still film is, a modern film shot on a modern film stock still looks a million times more beautiful than even the greatest Arri Alexa or whatever. And these are great cameras, but film will for the moment, film is still its own thing.
Yeah, the magic is real, isn't it?
Yeah, and I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon, to be honest.
Well, thanks to people like you two. Hopefully, people come and see the films and keep supporting the BFI and keep ploughing our money into the National Lottery without any wins, but knowing it's going to good places. I'll keep coming back. Yeah.
My sister won 30 quid yesterday on the lottery, and I noticed on her screen grab she had the BA and EasyJet tabs open. I thought, that's a bit presumptuous, isn't it?
Well, how much is a ticket for King Kong? She could buy a couple, maybe.
Oh, that's a good question. I think it's £12.
There you go.
Yeah. And if you're a member,
and
it's
some
cheaper.
Change. Yeah, there you go.
But it's selling pretty well. I know the screening that I'm introducing it's not sold out, but it's selling fast. And if you miss it, it's listen to me. If you miss it, it's on the Monday as well. But not everyone wants to go to cinema on the Monday.
Yeah, these opportunities to see these films do come and go, over the years. I mean, there's many things I wish I could have come to see here that I haven't had the opportunity to. So do take the chance, folks. I hope you enjoyed my conversation there with Doug and Kieron. As I said in the conversation, I'm not going to be around for either of those screenings, unfortunately. My work, as you may well know, is mostly at weekends. I'm in television, sport, mostly. So when you're watching the television on your days off at the weekend, that's when I'm working most often. So I do miss a lot of things, but I hope to catch some future screenings, and hopefully they do get another film-on-film season there, like they had when I saw Jaws there on 35mm. For those of you that follow on social media, you might have seen the Peter Kieron Kickstarter project, where he is going to recreate the opening titles from The Thing, the John Carpenter classic. The good news is that Peter has finished filming, and he's sent me a prelim edit of the piece to check over and give him some feedback on. And I have to say, it's great. He's recreated the title. I even got goosebumps watching it because it looks so cool, and it's great to see how he did it with the fish tank and the smoke and the garbage bag plastic. He really has put a lot of effort into reproducing this, and of course saving this bit of film history for us to watch. So hopefully that will be released to everybody to look at in the coming weeks. Just a reminder that you can buy the unauthorized Return of the Jedi Timeline book that Justin Berger and I put together. He also has got the Empire Timeline book. If you want to look for those, they're both on Amazon, or you can visit JediTimeline.com. If you search for Jedi Timeline or Empire Timeline on Amazon in your region, you can buy it there in paperback and in hardback as well. One of the advantages of having it print on demand with Amazon is that we don't have hundreds of them in our bedrooms and our garages and sheds, but it also does mean that we barely make any money on the book. So your purchase would be appreciated if you want to support the podcast in that way. Or you can go to the website, filmumentaries.com, and there is a PayPal donation button there if you wanted to send some money in that form, because I know not everybody wants to get involved with the whole Patreon thing. Paddy Tyndall and I are continuing to find time to make our documentary about production designer Joe Alves, who of course worked on Jaws and Close Encounters with Spielberg, but also did a couple of movies with John Carpenter. He worked for Hitchcock, he was friends with Paul Newman, race cars as well, and has an amazing collection of artefacts from his 4 decades in the industry. If you're interested in helping to fund the film, please get in touch, or if you know anyone who is an angel investor, we really have a good thing here. We have a lot of footage shot, we have a great story in mind, we just need to find the time. The problem is, when you've got other things that pay the bills, these projects become the last priority, but we need to find the time, we need to find some money and push it on to the next phase. We're hoping to get a pitch deck together and another trailer to show potential investors and hopefully get this well and truly off the ground. Okay, next up on the podcast, I have Andrew Whitehurst. Andrew is an Academy Award-winning VFX supervisor with 20 years experience in the industry, including commercials and television as well. He's worked a couple of times with Sam Mendes on the Bond movies. He also worked with Alex Garland on Ex Machina. And we also chat about his work on Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. Then I've got my conversation with Marianne Infield, who again worked for ILM for a bunch of years. She was there during the Return of the Jedi era, working as a camera assistant. She has some interesting insights in the industry as a camera woman. I also have a conversation with effects supervisor and educator Ty Ruben Ellingson. So yeah, a bunch of interesting conversations coming up. Oh, also Kevin Jenkins, production designer, who worked on the later Star Wars movies. He also worked as a concept designer on Edge of Tomorrow and on Rogue One as well. So plenty more coming your way. One other thing to mention on the Patreon side of things is that I have created a couple of threads on there for general announcements and questions. So if you want to contribute to the podcast with a question or get a name check, then come on to patreon.com/Jamie Benning or find me on social media. But on Patreon, you can join those kind of closed groups, if you like, to chat about. And I think you can do that if you're a free member as well. But you won't get things if you're a free member like the exclusive videos and the ad-free podcast. You'll get those if you contribute. As I said earlier, just $12 for an entire year. I mean, that's a couple of coffees. And, this is work. And for those of you that can't afford it, don't worry. Just share the information. Just tell people, share on social media, tell your friends about the podcast. Because I really can't do this without you. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you can do so for the next episode of the Filmumentaries podcast.
Weirding Way